السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. صباح الخير على جميع الحضور. نبدأ معكم اليوم الثاني من الدورة الخامسة لمنتدى
Peace be upon you. We start today the second day of our event, and this is the fourth session with the title The Common Gulf Identity, the Horizons and Perspectives. So the speakers will be having their presentations and then we open the discussion. Alanoud Al Khalifa will talk about the Gulf identity in the light of the conflicts in the Gulf. And Amel Hammami will make a comparison between the Gulf identity and European identity. Since we don't have a man among the speakers, so we start with Amel Hammami. And she's specialist in law and economy. She's graduated from the Sousse University in Tunisia. Her paper will be about the identity, Gulf identity.
I believe that each one of us is to some extent national. So I believe that the nation is a story of identity that needs to be told and told again. That's why I believe also that without this identity, there could be no true and durable legitimacy attached to a political entity. That's why the sovereign states today, they continue working to consolidate their identity, while the emerging political entity, they try to construct an identity that can justify their existence and guarantee their continuity. Unlike the previous research work that is mainly related to the civic ethnic approach, in this study I used the motivated identity construction theory to question, to question the motives behind the process of making an identity in the EU and in the GCC. And I found that this process succeeded to not really make, but to construct and to harmonize the multitude of different identities in the EU and couldn't blur the boundaries between the Khaliji citizens. The identity construction is two phases. First, the foundation, أو ما نعبر عنه بالعربي بمرحلة التأسيس, and after that, the institutionalization. And the second phase is my topic today. So I will question the motives behind the institutionalization or the officialization of a common identity in the GCC and in the EU. So my presentation will be like that. So first I will study the push factor in this process. I will use the political and the economic motives, and after that the pull factors. I will mainly focus on culture, history, and education variables. After that, a short overview about the challenges that face this identity construction. But let me first give you a short synopsis about the commonalities between the EU identity construction and the Gulf Cooperation Council identity construction, commonalities that hide a lot of divergence. Starting with the literature I used in this paper, I found that the pace of the academic research about these two identities doesn't reflect their existential situation. In fact, few are those who transformed the Khaliji identity into a research topic, but they all recognized its existence. An identity that sustains thanks to the strong cultural homogeneity between the Gulf states. Conversely, In the EU, there is strong research framework, but this doesn't hide the fragility of the sui generis identity of Europe. Another commonality is related to the nature of these two identities. They are both mosaic identities. They are built on sub or micro identities. Indeed, a majority of the Khaliji citizens, they still identify themselves by their tribal origins. Although also in Europe, the identity is embarked on sub-national identities, like, for example, the Basque, the Bavarian, the Catalan, or even the Irish. However, in contrast with the Gulf politics that appreciates and internalizes the tribal identities, the EU and its member states, they are skeptic about their subnational identities, and they perceive them as a rival project. So a third commonality also is related to the geographical dimension. Both the Khaliji and the European are regional identities. Although EU is not all of Europe yet, it is always referred to as such. Similarly, in the GCC also, GCC doesn't comprise all the Gulf states today, yet. But I think that it subjugated the region political identity. However, the EU wants to go beyond its borders and reach to everyone. What is here in the Gulf, the states or even the identity is still living within boundaries. So moving now to the push factors, as I said, I will deal with the economic factor and the political factor. Starting with the political factor, I found that since 1981, day of the inauguration of the Gulf Cooperation Council, this Khaliji identity has been a ceremonial identity or a ceremonial discourse. It didn't upgrade to be an institution or a policy. In contrast, in the EU, they worked very hard and they invested a lot in making one narrative and in making a narrative of one community in Europe. This is because after the Second World War, one and the common Europe was the only way for the European nations to retrieve their international leading role. There is also a disparity on the role of these two regional organizations. In fact, the EU presents itself as one community in the international relations. It also joined a lot of conventions and the treaties as a distinguished party. What is here in the GCC, we see that the member states of the organization, they still present themselves as different political entity. There is also difference between the political institutions of the GCC and the EU, because the EU developed the new institutions that are devoted to consolidating the one European identity, like the House of European History, like the Ministries of European Integration or European Affairs in each member state. Whereas here in the GCC, I see that the GCC institutions are stagnating today. But despite the international actorness of the EU and its institutional proliferation, we see that it didn't come yet to build the European persona, the Europeans. In this perspective, I found this quotation, it's in French. Unfortunately, I didn't find an English translation, authentic English translation. Nous avons fait l'Europe, il faut maintenant faire des Européens, but it means that maybe we made Europe, we now have to make Europeans. Of course, it's not authentic, but in contrast, here in the GCC, the identity, of course, it's not an institution, or at least we agree that it is not a formal institution. It is not a political institution, but it is more than a political creature. It is a cultural heritage that is handed over from one generation to another. The Arabic language, the Bedouin lifestyle, all of those values, they always featured the Khaliji persona. So also I found that the European identity showed weakness against the political troubles. For example, after the Brexit or even the Brexit, questioned or retrieved to the front the whole idea of European identity, which was not the case with the Khaliji identity. It was not a topic of dispute or revisionism after the Gulf crisis. But we all believe that the Gulf crisis has impacted the institutionalization of this identity. Going now to the economic factor, I see that similarly to the idea of nation in Europe, the idea of common identity in Europe is also a result to economic interests in Europe. So the common identity reflects a need to consolidate the common market, a consolidation that resulted in bigger, richer, and stronger market from which both the citizens and the ruling elite, they benefit. It also strengthened the bargaining power of the EU and its member states. And in this framework, the normative power Europe appeared. This power allowed the EU to impose and to enforce changes in other states by the means of the market. And I think that the specific economic factor didn't play the same role here in the GCC, because the political interests, they slow down the institutionalization process, because I see that we kept competing over the same products and the same markets. Also, I don't see that the financial revenues of the resource endowment was invested in a Gulf regional, strategic, cultural, or social program. So moving now to the pull factors, as I said, I will deal with the culture, with history, and with religion. So I made this comparison, and I found that in the GCC, all the member states, they speak one official language. Whereas in the EU, we have 27 or 28 member states, but we have 24 different official language. And when it comes to religion, here in the GCC, they share a common religious belief based on the Islamic heritage. Whereas in the EU, the rhetoric, the religious rhetoric and institutions, they play different roles and they have different powers in each state. And speaking about history, I found no such comparison. I cannot compare between the EU and the Gulf, because here there is all the countries that share common narrative and common history. Whereas in the EU, honestly, there is no foundation or basis for the European integration. But the EU has invested in building the narrative and the idea of common history that doesn't exist. But here in the GCC, I think that the institutions, they didn't pay attention to this factor. Education also played a determinant role in institutionalizing identity. For example, in the EU, the political institutions, they channeled their efforts towards conveying the European identity using the education programs. Here, for example, we have the Erasmus program. The philosophy behind the Erasmus program is thinking about the next generations, so do something for them, to ingrain in them the idea of one common European citizenship, so that with time, they will abolish the idea of nationalism. But here, I think in the GCC, I would be happy to hear about something similar in the next few years. The process of identity construction also face external challenges in terms of migration or international relations or different geostrategic interests. Speaking about migration, I found that it impacted the identity construction process in the EU and in the GCC. In fact, after the big oil discoveries in the Gulf, the region became the favorite destination for various different foreign workforces. Europe also has long history with migration that dates back to the 17th century, day of the first European colonies in Africa and in Asia. And migrants in these two cases, they present different religious, cultural, and social background, and they were perceived as a threat to the Khaliji Hawiyya and traditions, and also to the European acquis and security, and migration in those two cases was answered in different ways. For example, in Europe, the European governments, they established or they created simulation or cultural and social containment migration policy. They aimed to absorb the migrants in the social European sphere, disregarding their cultural or their social or their even ethnic origins. Whereas here in the GCC, the Khaliji societies, they opted to push the migrants towards establishing their parallel and disconnected communities where they maintained their traditions and their languages. Moving now to the last factor, the international relations. We all know that the United States, the NATO, and the Marshall Plan had determined role in the making of the EU or Europe after the Second World War, whereas here in the GCC, the making of a common identity didn't get any external support, and maybe even the opposite happened. And this identity here faces, let's say, a lot of internal divide and challenges because of the different international relations and geostrategic interests of each member state. Here also, I have to mention that in the EU, the member states, they also face continuous foreign policy divide, but they often come to mitigate this divide by prioritizing their common economic, social, or even cultural interests. This is thanks to the European institutions that mitigate the problems and that coordinate between the states. Whereas here in the GCC, the institutions, they still don't play the same role and they don't have the same power over their member state. So this geostrategic divide in these two cases plays, let's say, a critical role in halting the institutionalization process of a common identity. So, and concerning my conclusion, I found only a few results. So I found that these two projects are driven by an existential fear. In fact, the economic, political, cultural, and strategic challenges that face the European project and the Khaliji project, they confirmed the necessity of establishing a common identity that can face the distraction factors. So the consolidation of the idea of one identity, one nation, one political and economic interests in the collective memory of the next generations in Khalij or in Europe, so they will immune the two projects as institutions and immune even the citizens against the imminent dangers of hatred, of radicalization, and of course of cultural uprooting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Before moving to the next speaker, you mentioned in your paper different aspects. I want to ask you a question. Don't you think that there is a difference between the official and the popular level in Europe and in the Gulf area? Of course, in Europe, the people are very keen to keep their identity. Therefore, the governments looked for common ground to keep all the elements of identity in the Gulf area. Actually, everything is similar, but the governments did the opposite. They looked for differences and aspects of disagreement. So don't you think that the problem or the core problem are the governments? Yes, I do agree with you. Identity is a political product. We might have a lot of similar aspects, but then maybe we don't have the same identity. For example, we Arabs, we have the same language, but in the Maghreb, we see ourselves different than the Gulf, and the Gulf see themselves different than us. So I think we don't focus on the joint interests. The Europeans were able, and they succeeded to find out the common aspects and the common points. So therefore, they lay the ground for a common identity. Actually, we are dependent on the West economically and politically. Everyone is trying to grow and succeed on the detriment of the other. So we're not trying to focus on the joint interests. Thank you very much. We move now to the following paper with Alanoud Al Khalifa. She is a PhD student in Qatar University, and she's interested about developing a knowledge-based economy in the Gulf area, and she has a number of publications in this regard. She worked for 10 years in the Ministry of Economy here in Qatar. She's going to talk about the Gulf identity in the light of the differences and disagreements between the countries of the Gulf. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this symposium for giving me the opportunity to participate through this paper under the title which you just mentioned. The GCC, since its establishment, has been omnipresent on the political scene, and it fostered the Gulf identity, but nowadays this identity is facing a lot of challenges, especially because of the political differences between the member states, and after the Arab Spring, these differences and disagreements increased. Actually, there are different positions of the member states towards the Arab Spring. Apart from that, we have the blockade. So here I tried to examine and to analyze the notion of Gulf identity, and I wanted to know what are the factors that affected this identity at the course of its history, and what will be the future of the Gulf identity, and also what was the impact of national programs for identity strengthening. And are we talking here about a Gulf identity or a national identity? What comes first? So I want to talk about four aspects here. The first one focuses on anthropological explanation of identity and how identity evolves and changes, and what's the nature of this notion during conflicts. And also the paper focuses on the broad notion of Gulf identity. The second aspect talks about the deployed efforts by member states to foster Gulf identity and to strengthen loyalty and cultural belonging. The last two the aspects focus on the political disagreements, especially the last Gulf crisis, which is actually the biggest crisis, the challenge in the history of the Gulf region. So, as you all know, Gulf countries are homogeneous when it comes to religion, to history, language, and this, of course, facilitated the establishment of the GCC Council, which was aimed to face the challenges that are seen in the region. We know that the area is very rich, and of course also there was a security reason due to the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and also the war or the threat coming from Iraq. So there was a security concern to establish a GCC Council, but it also expressed as a collective belonging to the same unit. The national identities are not opposed to the Gulf identity. So it's The Gulf identity is an umbrella for all national identities. Of course, there are different ways how every individual defines his belonging. One individual might feel first his Gulf identity first and then the national identity, or the vice versa. So this depends on the environment in which the individual is living. The project of Gulf identity was not an easy task. So the GCC Council achieved what we call the economic citizenship, which was aiming to bring all economies in the region to a similar level. Also, the GCC identity was strengthened in particular times. For example, after the invasion of Iraq of Kuwait, at that time the GCC countries had a clear joint and shared political vision. In that crisis, the Gulf identity was strongly felt, and everyone was talking about the Gulf people or Gulf citizens, and there was also the same media discourse and media coverage, and it was strengthening and emphasizing the joint destiny. In the last years, we noticed that the GCC Council took steps to strengthen national identities against Gulf identities. For example, in 2014, 3 countries introduced military service: Qatar, UAE, and Qatar. So Kuwait, Qatar, UAE. And we know that the military service has actually a cultural and a national aim, and also to develop a national political discourse. It is also important to say that the development, the cultural development in the area, such as the different museums available here in Qatar, these museums also strengthen the national feeling, they strengthen the national identity. And for example, the different festivals, Al Janadriya festival, because of lack of time, I'm trying just to mention some quick examples. What I wanted to mention in this regard, these programs, of course, increase the level of national identity against the joint Gulf identity. For example, the joint production through the GCC production organization started for many years, and I think this organization resumed working a few months ago, maybe. So I think this organization was protecting the cultural heritage of the Gulf area. The GCC countries are going now to increase the national identity, and also when it comes to political disagreements and differences between GCC countries. This is nothing new, actually. In the last quarter of the previous century, there were different border conflicts, and the countries resorted to some international organizations for arbitration. And also, we should not forget that we have an arbitration system at the level of GCC, but unfortunately, this system had no role in solving these problems, these border conflicts. That's why the countries resorted to an international body to solve their differences. There were also a long history in terms of disagreements and differences within the area. No, this was clear after the breakout of the Arab Spring, and we saw that there was a competition over specific issues. The Arab Spring changed the balance of powers in the region. There was also a collision of policies of GCC countries because of disparities, because of discrepancies within the texture of the GCC countries, and also the absence of a joint political vision to overcome all challenges. And we can say that there is no joint foreign policy. So there are a lot of challenges facing the GCC countries. As I said, the GCC body has another institution which is a non-political one, and it says that there is a ethical commitment to discuss the foreign policy and to try to develop a joint policy, and this relation allowed the GCC countries to follow their own policies. So this was an umbrella trying to bring together all countries, but at the same time there was a gap. Through which different countries tried to take their own path, and also there was a big conflict of interest. In the course of history, only the elite was dealing with the differences and disagreements between the GCC countries, and the recent Gulf crisis took a different path because it reached a very, very deep point, especially the social texture and the structure of the Gulf people. Kuwait Emir said that we were close to a military operation, and this is a big threat for the whole region. And also the media coverage, the media discourse, all the press and media institutions try to deepen this disagreement and differences between GCC countries. And also the blockading countries prevented their citizens from showing empathy towards Qatar. So in this crisis, we can say that the GCC Council gave up all its achievements and all aspects of gender vision. Also, they gave up the freedom of movement, the freedom of movement of people, and financial services, and so on. So here we saw a strengthening of national identities against a joint identity of the Gulf region. And the citizens of GCC area responded differently to this crisis. As I said, the notion of identity in the GCC area is changing according to the prevailing political environment. Every individual can be Arab, from the Gulf region, from Oman, from any other background, but whenever there is a kind of insecurity, everyone starts to go back to his original identity, either a national or a religious identity. And the same applies also to the different interpretations of the Islamic faith, the 4 different interpretations. Whenever there is any disagreement, GCCs and citizens also try to go back to the interpretation adopted in their countries. The GCC identity played a major role for stability in the region since its establishment in 1981. And we have a lot of families and tribes which overcame the issue of nationality, but because of the political differences and political disagreements between the member countries, push the citizens back to their own national identities, especially in times of crisis. And we saw the level of division and disagreement in this context. We can say a lot of contradiction this level, and large groups of society are now trying to focus on the differences, and there is a lack of confidence within societies in the GCC countries. We still have a double standard, and the political act is always coming first. The citizens of the GCC area would always like to keep their national identity if there is any crisis. During the last years, we saw that GCC Council was unable to strengthen a national or a GCC joint identity. And the most important, during this current crisis, we saw that the leaders of GCC countries put the national identity above the GCC identity. The future of the Gulf identity is unclear, and I think this issue needs further study. The majority of studies that talked about this topic, they analyzed maybe the future of economic integration, and there was no focus on the identity per se, and there are very few studies in this regard. There is an intention to expand this paper, if you allow. Tyler Corley developed a social theory, and I think this is important. We can also apply this at the level of GCC identity. She spoke in one of her studies about the EU identity, and Kelly's assessment might be in line with what we might have here also in GCC area. UAE, Saudi, Bahrain, excluding Qatar, is opposed to the openness of Qatar, of Qatari diplomacy, and also applying this theory in the EU, who's aiming at bringing new members into this organization. But the situation in the GCC area is different. And with this, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for Mrs. Alanoud Al Khalifa. A question: you mentioned that governments had to use the tribal concept when they had a crisis or political crisis. In the long run, and what is happening in naturalization in Bahrain in many countries, people from Pakistan and others who are not from the Arab region, keeping the national identity and keeping other nationalities. In Jeddah, many inhabitants are not Arabs. Maybe after the Gulf crisis, there will be a need to establish or to construct a new identity, maybe a new Middle East. The sound is off. The matter needs study, to be studied deeply, because there are many critical issues in our Gulf region. Thank you. So we go to the third paper today. Nesib Battaloglu. She's a PhD student in Ankara and researcher assistant in the Qatar University. She had many researches in the Gulf area and within the Middle East. She participated in work in Cambridge and
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here after 2.5 years in Doha, and I would like to thank to all these organizing this event and inviting me. Today, I will try to focus on the identity in the Gulf from a different angle, namely how this identity in the regional and the national level is influenced by the international factors in essence. So as an introduction, it's clear that the identities and the Gulf presents a unique case, if not exceptional, given the existing of multiple cross-boundary and the layered identities in this part of the world. However, when I researched through this topic, I found a gap in the literature, namely that there is a little or none research focused on how these identities is affected by the international factors, because much of the studies analyzes how identities affects the foreign policy making, the other way around. So the core argument of this paper looks at the identity as a construction from a different angle, namely the how those international factors and recognizing that those international factors are important dynamics in shaping identities in the Arab Gulf states. So in terms of the theoretical framework, I researched through the various theories and the literature review. And the first thing is to recognize is that the identity with different forms and layers is an indispensable part of the analysis, any analysis on this region actually. However, there is a long-term dominance of the realist accounts, namely the balance of power rhetoric, in explaining the Middle East politics and the Gulf politics, international relations in particular. I think they have merits. Those realist accounts have their own merits, but they miss such important points, such as the role of the identity in foreign policy or the ideational factors in constructing international relations of the states. So I turned to an alternative theory, which is the constructivist. Thank you. International relations theory, which enable us to think that the international politics are structured by both social and the material forces, and such structures shapes actors' identities and interests. So here I treat identity as a variable to analyze, which is shaping and is both shaped by the international system. Based on the Alexander Wendt's writings, here I endogenize the identity to the international or the systemic forces. From an anthropologic perspective, also, I treat the identity as something fluid and something in flux. So this is a way to approach the constructivism in international relations theory, in which the identity and the structure are in constant interaction with each other and shapes each other. So before moving to the selection of the cases or the international factors at play, I would like to share some characteristics of the identity formation in the Arab Gulf states. So here, and these findings are based on mainly the secondary data literature review. The first thing is to highlight is that the state formation in this part of the world and the nation building took place in a short span of time, because much of the states took their independence in the second half of the 20th century, and this process is complicated by the incongruence between state and the still powerful sub- and supra-state identities of the populace. Therefore, or as a result, the identity has been a contested notion and had multiple definitions. The second common characteristics among those states is the prominent role of the state as the sole power in constructing national identity, or affecting the formation of the national identity. Because, or thanks to the extraction of the hydrocarbon resources and the revenue, state was able to penetrate into the society through its institutions and public services. So, as a result, national identity and nationalism have formed through the influence of the state rather than the way around. The third common characteristic in this process is the lack of a self-determination struggle in this part of the world, in the Gulf. So the nationalism and identity construction is not formed around a revolution or war of independence / unification. So as a related process, there is an inward-facing chauvinism to explain the identity is partly measured against the internal demographic threats, not against other nations. As a fourth and last point, I would like to highlight the revival of tribalism as a part of the national identity debate, especially since 1990s. There is a modern and new imagination of the past and the tradition in this debate. So going back to the core forces that I selected, I here have three cases, and the first one is the forces of pan-Arabism and pan-Islamism, and how this shaped, how this influenced the construction of the Khaliji identity. So here I examined the two forces with their ideational and material capabilities as sources of threat for the monarchies in the Gulf. So in the first case, the pan-Arabists, and in other cases, Nasserist sentiments usually are in the past attacked on the Gulf monarchies for being either tribal or the puppet regime of the Western-dominated countries. And after the discovery of oil and the pouring of the hydrocarbon money to the Gulf, there was a gap between two Arabs, Arabs with oil and Arabs with non-oil. Therefore, there was a discussion about the oil for all Arabs on the one hand, and there is a reaction from the Gulf states about the state exclusivity over the natural resources. On the more material level, actually, Nasser was able to send troops to the Yemen, to one of the most inhospitable regions in the world about the revolutionary change. So, in the material side as well, the pan-Arabism was perceived as a threat from the Gulf states. Then we had the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the rhetoric of Ayatollah Khomeini about exporting the revolution to the neighboring state. This development did not ease any concern, but further cemented the cautious towards the pan-Islamism because its potential power to resonate with many Gulf citizens. Here I read the establishment of the GCC in a different angle than balance of power rhetoric. Here I said that the establishment of the GCC and the Khaliji construction of Khaliji identity was an ideological balancing against both pan-Arabism and pan-Islamism. So as quoting from Michael Barnett and Gregory Goss, one purpose of the GCC was to provide Gulf citizens with a rhetorical and an institutional alternative identity. The second case I examined is related to the first one in somehow, and it's the outreaching Asian labor markets and the societal security concerns in the Gulf. In retrospect, one can read that especially after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, Gulf states were trying to replace the Arab Gulf force with an Asian labor force, and as a result, there was a changes in the society in terms of demographic imbalances. So not only the last remaining forces of Pan-Arabism affected this process, but also the globalization and the dynamics of international labor markets has created the national identity debate in the Gulf. So here is a table from 2015 showing that the percentage of the non-nationals in the total population reaches up to 90% in United Arab Emirates, with a almost 50% average in the GCC. So the debate on national identity has crystallized around few themes, and the first one is the diminishing use of the Arabic language in the Gulf. Also, there was debates about how the new ideas, new lifestyles, and new societal forms have come to the Gulf with this, especially the high-skilled labor from the Western countries. So I sketched through to some news and news articles mentioning on this topic, and there is one from Al Arabiya from 2013 saying that this process affecting the Arabic and Islamic character of the Arabian Gulf states, damaging the unity of society and presenting an existential threat. So, in a nutshell, societal security became part and parcel of identity debates and policies on the identity formation in the Gulf. I said policies because when you analyze most of the national visions, there is they highlight the notions of identity, culture, heritage, social norms rooted in Arab and Muslim identities as the basic referent objects of societal security. As a last case, I examined to introduce CC Rift and put a question mark here: is there a new nationalism in Qatar? Because the event is very recent and it requires longer term in analysis, I believe we can say something about something has changed regarding the identity debate in Qatar. So, facing with severe sanctions and an actual physical blockage from neighboring Gulf states, a sense of rethinking over nation-state, borders, sovereignty, and national identity has started to be debated in Qatar. So this blockage has took place since May 2017 with the closing borders from the Saudi-led quartet and restricting this air and sea space for the airborne traffic. So, on economical and political aspects, Qatar did manage to adapt to this new normal as a small state in isolation. Yet, with capitals, crisis has played a role in as an international factor on the national identity and created a break from the previous patterns that I presented a few slides ago. So, in the first place, there is a new chapter of self-determination and national moment in Qatar's history. This was not an actual war of troops and soldiers, but it was a war of its own kind, and the people in Qatar, both nationals and non-nationals, had to deal with this blockage, with their financial transactions, with their travels, with their cross-national family ties, and even with the supermarket shelves. So the first reaction, one of the most early reactions of this crisis from the Qatar was the explosion of the patriotic fervor, which crystallized around the Qatari Emir Sheikh Tamim as a national hero. So here, in the media, I have followed. There were slogans saying that we are all Tamim, we are all Qatar. You have the world, we have Tamim. So as a related point, something has also changed. From inward-facing chauvinism, there is a nationalism towards external states or the neighboring states. So in the celebrations of the 2017 National Day, both nationals and expats showed solidarity and unity amid this crisis. And when I read through the interviews of the Qataris, I came across with this quotation saying that especially with the Gulf CH, we actually feel more proud of to be part of this nation. We feel more proud of the unity between not only the nationals but also the expat. We are celebrating hand in hand. So as a result, in this crisis, with this crisis, the concerns over the national societal security is eased, if not erased, in this perspective. The third one is the changing role of the state as the sole power in forming national identity. With this crisis, or in the aftermath of this crisis, larger segments of the society, namely the NGOs, artists, or even the lay citizens, found some ways to express their opinions and join the debates on national identity, or the discussions on national identity. One of the most well-known manifestation of this, the image of the Tamim the Glorious, which went viral and became a national symbol in this process. So, with this crisis, people in Qatar carved out a national identity and reaffirmed their nation's independence. Last but not least, this crisis also created a dent in the notion of Khaliji identity, and this shows that the crisis is not contained within the national borders of Qatar. It also affected the region-wide collective identification, at least at the Qatari part. So when you talk to some Qataris, there is a despair and disappointment towards a region-wide sense of belonging. And one Qatari interviewer told me that the Khaliji identity is all about values, traditions, and Islamism. Under the current crisis, we see all the three characteristics have been used against the union of Khaliji identity by the blockage countries. So this shows that this crisis also had the regional repercussions on the identity formation and identity construction in the Gulf. For a few concluding remarks and the thoughts on the future research, I would say that I try to show the fluidity of identity and the role of the international factors in shaping those identities in the Arab Gulf states. Of course, further research on the Gulf can contribute to the theory formation and theory construction on this topic, and it can contribute largely to the international relations theory itself. There is a need to conduct study in the cases of Kuwait and Oman, as well as the other Gulf states, which might support my argument. Also, the further qualitative data with more interviews and the secondary data analysis would contribute or would increase the applicability and the validity of this paper. So thank you for your listening. I would like to hear your opinions and questions. Thank you.
Thank you for Ustadha Oglu. And while you prepare your questions, I will ask her. You talked about the manpower, labor power to the Gulf. Don't you think that this forced the Gulf countries at a certain time to solve or to change its national identity in order to be able to integrate those newcomers, and I mean here Qatar, Bahrain, and Emirates, and at this moment Saudi Arabia.
You are asking that whether this the labor force has forced Gulf states to change their national identity, for some of them for further integration. Well, I'm not an expert of the topic, unfortunately, but yes, I believe that some of the elements in the identity would change, but I would like to see this labor force as an international factor, that as a pull factor for more conscious and consolidated national identity in the Gulf.
تفضل. ناخذ 3 أسئلة ثم نعود للإجابة عليها في المنصة. يرجى تحديد أول شيء
We take 3 questions and we answer them.
شكرا سيد رئيس الجلسة. أنا حيدر سعيد.
Thank you. I'm Haidar Said from the Arab Center.
يعني ملاحظاتي تخص ورقتي.
My comments concern Alanoud Al Khalifa. I think that the Gulf identity needs more research. It's complex and I know that there is limitations and a lot of differences. So this Gulf area, which is on the there is a country which is on the Red Sea, and another country which is on the Arab Sea. Saudi is on the Red Sea. And Oman is not on the Arabic Gulf. A very small part. And Oman is different. And historically it's completely different and culturally different from the Gulf countries. But when the idea started that these countries have a common culture, but I have a reserve about the fact that the Gulf GCC is the point of start. Is the did the GCC identity started as a response to Abdel Nasser nationalism in the 50s. I am talking about the Gulf, and after the departure of the Britons in the 70s, the idea of the Gulf was a balance against Saudi. So I am just questioning. Is it against pan-Islamism also? Because at the same time Saudi was supporting the Islamic organization. So how did it happen that we can speak about? For the speakers or presenters, the national trend, Oman is on the Gulf, and we know that the Gulf coast is a Gulf coast before it changes, and this reflects on the discussion. But I agree that it is complex and we need more research and study in depth. And this brings us to some wrong ideas in or ways in reading the history. When we look at these elements, and these are common elements. Alanoud talked about the future of the identity. So we are talking about the scenarios. So what are the scenarios that that we could see in the or for the Gulf identity? Will we go back to the national identity, or will we try to adapt and have a new Gulf identity? Dr. Amel, you compared the European identity and Gulf identity. Don't you think that doing this comparison is not possible, because the European Union was built on the interest, what is the interest of this union, and also the consolidation of the citizenship. So it's a political decision of the elite. The countries, the populations don't have a role in this.
Mohammed Al-Masri from the Arab Center. Just please go ahead for a question if you have a question. You have the power. I just want to add something to what Dr. Haida said. and let us challenge him. Is there really something we may call Gulf identity? Whenever we talk about Gulf identity, we try to explain things from the point of view of KSA. And here we go back to the conflict of Abdel Nasser with KSA, not with the Gulf. We understand in the Gulf there was empathy with Abdel Nasser against KSA. When did the identity in KSA form? So there was a discussion in the 20s. Was the KSA able to put all citizens under the umbrella of one identity? Are people in Najd similar to those in Hijaz and so on? So there is, or there have always been a contradiction in this regard. I think there is a difference at this level. When you talk about a revenue or a sponsorship system and labor and so on, these issues are common, but are these common aspects leading to shaping a new identity? So this is something different. For example, GCC citizens are portrayed in a different way than the rest of the Arab citizens. But again, does this shape GCC identity? If you allow me, I want to add another thing. Identity is not related only to interests. Actually, there is no European identity, and there is nothing common between Europeans, so we can talk about identity. There is what we may call a construction. And we cannot say that there is a European identity which is against the Arab identities. And even the English identity in the beginning of the millennium, they were talking about the elements of this identity. Do we hate France? Do we hate championships and carry? So what is the definition of this identity? So we take a bunch of answers before going back to the room and taking more questions. So we give the floor to Mrs. Amel to tell us about or to answer the question related to the identity. Yes, I do agree with you. Partly, every identity has its own characteristics. I studied here only the institutionalization of the identity in the EU. There are institutions to convince and persuade the people, the nations of Europe about the necessity of shaping a common identity. But even though in the Arab world we have a lot of common ground, we don't have the same institutions. I want to say that talking about the European identity started in 1957. College of Europe is an institution which is a hub for all leaders of Europe. Since 1957, all the leadership of Europe is coming from this college as an academic institution. So I think we need to believe that we have a common culture regarding the institutionalization of the identity here in GCC area. We have a lot of common aspects. For example, in Europe there is a concern towards Russia, culturally speaking, and so on. But so militarily and economically speaking, of course, they are concerned towards Russia. That's why they established this body as a structure to face Russia. But for us, we need to deepen this identity, and we need to leave this heritage for the coming generations. We are also facing common challenges, common threats. When we have this feeling of belonging, I think for the coming generations they will defend the same position, and we can define our enemies and our friends on this basis. Thank you. The Gulf identity, are we gonna rely on the national identity, or are we going to have a joint identity plus what Dr. Haidar said? Microphone. The cultural homogeneity is very important, and this paved the way for a better collaboration and cooperation between the GCC countries, and this led also to shaping a joint identity. So this existed earlier. Regarding the scenarios, I think we need much deeper study. As I said earlier, there are very few studies which addressed the GCC identity. If the GCC identity goes on, I think we'll have confidence crisis. Thank you very much, Mrs. Nesib. There was another question which relates to difference of identity in the Gulf area. And this difference or disagreement makes GCC countries focus on their national identity.
Thank you. I will try to respond to the questions in a brief way. The differences among the GCC states is obvious. The ones you more studied, you see that there is less to generalize, and it's very difficult to construct a unified front on this matter. But for the sake of some academic research, we had to treat them as something comparable or studied together. But I totally agree that when we have some member state like Saudi Arabia with a distinct history, size, population combination, and other things, it makes it very difficult to talk about a unified GCC identity or a regional identity. I totally agree with that. But because Saudi Arabia is one of those states in the Gulf or in the GCC, we had to talk about it as well, I believe. For responding to Nasserism as a threat to the identity, I think I have to make clear that I'm not only talking about Nasserism in terms of pan-Arabism. I had to talk more about the Iraqi pan-Arabism as well, which was an aggressive one since the Iran-Iraq war, and as we all see after the aftermath. 1 decade after, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, so it was a threat, I believe. For the pan-Islamism, I had to again clarify what kind of pan-Islamism I am talking about. Here, I talk about the revolutionary or the Iranian version of pan-Islamism as a threat in this sense. So for the definition of the identity, yes, it also shows that there is a lack of a unified stance in this regard, academically or in the practical manner, because of the complexities of identity in this part of the world, I believe. And also the notion of identity is also something really difficult or is impossible to measure. We only study their influences upon us, like power in international relations, so I don't have a clear definition of identity in hand. I couldn't find as well.
شكرا. لدي 10 دقائق والمطلوب 7
I still have 10 minutes. We'll take 7 questions, so we'll take the questions very quickly so we can go to the answers and wrap up. So the questions, please. Alanoud Al Khalifa from the Foreign Ministry. I'd like to thank the speakers for their presentations. My question goes to Alanoud Al Khalifa. You mentioned in your paper that GCC countries introduced compulsory military service in some countries, and you said that this is a political and social challenge. According to you, why GCC countries didn't think about military service before this, some years ago, for example? Yes, sir, we take your question. Microphone, please. Microphone.
بس المايك لو سمحت.
السؤال بيطرح نفسه بقوة. هل الهوية تحديداتها منين؟ لأن المجتمع
How can we define the identity?
محددات
because society has also its own definition and dimensions.
ويمكن يكون أبدي هذا خاصة بالنسبة للدين أو folklore.
So we can talk about customs, about rituals, about religion, the economy, and so on. But for identity, how can we define identity?
المطبخ، الأعراس، الكذا، هاي هي العامل الأساسي في تكوين ما يسمى الهوية.
So for me, the most important, for defining an identity is language, religion, customs, tradition. But economy, it's going up and down. Thank you so much. We take the following question.
فقط بسبب ضيق الوقت يعني هناك أسئلة كثيرة.
في هوية خليجية يعني فيها واضح
نعم.
ولكن جزء هي أساسي من الثقافة العربية.
طيب.
وهذا الزمن الثقافة العربية طويل ممتاز. يمكن يصير حرب ويمكن يصير قتال
طيب.
بين دول، ولكن الهوية ثابتة.
شكرا لك. راح اترك الاجابه للمنصه، وان كانت بعض الامثله اللي ذكرتها متغيره، جزء كبير من ما ذكرته في الثقافه الخليجيه مكتسب.
Thank you very much. We'll get the answer from the panelist later.
أول شيء بس تسمح لي تعقيب بسيط على مداخلة الدكتور محمد المصري. الهوية الخليجية ليست سعودية، السعودية بالنسبة لي على
So just to comment, the Gulf identity has nothing to do with the identity of KC. I have a question to Amal and Alanoud. My question to Amal, personally, I think comparing between the EU and the GCC, I think this is comparing the incomparable, because there is a huge difference at the different levels. I'd like you to elaborate more about immigration in Europe and GCC area. I conducted also some studies, and there's a difference at the level of immigration. Immigration in GCC area is not the same as the immigration in Europe. In GCC area, we have limited immigration, and in the EU, we have also the refugee status, which is also a kind of immigration. And this brings me to ask a second question to Alanoud. You spoke about GCC identity. You spoke all about the recent political crisis. What if we really face a big economic crisis? What will be the impact in GCC societies? Are we going to see the same impact as it was for the political crisis? So we take another question. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, every Arab issue, when it's put to discussion, everyone is saying it's tough, it's complicated, it's complex, and there are no solutions. And I think this is unacceptable. Today we're talking about identity. I think we have a political and historical identity. The political identity goes hand in hand with the leadership, and everyone was singing when we established the GCC Council. That was in 1981. Everyone was singing songs of the Khaliji unity and so on. But the historical unity of GCC is clear, is a stronger identity. It's an Islamic Arab identity. It's present in Kuwait, in Qatar, in Oman, UAE. So I think we need to be committed to our historical identity, and whenever we face any crises, we need to go back and stick to our historical identity. So we should not talk about national identity here. It's only the result of the crisis, actually. And there is no absolute Qatari, UAE, or Kuwaiti, or KSA identity. We heard recently that KSA identity is being attacked and so on, but I think we as academics, we need to differentiate between the historical and the political identity. Thank you. We take your question. Dr. Fahd al-Nasser from Department of Social Sciences from Kuwait University. Actually, there is no identity to the. I can't see any identity. It's enough to have a look at the population structure and the globalization. I think we don't have closed societies which are protecting their own identity. Identity is that you are a Muslim, you're going to the mosque and so on, with all due respect. But when you want to talk about GCC identity, I think this is over.
You concluded in your conclusion that there are cases of Oman and Kuwait. So I'd like to know, what are these cases? Are these examples or case studies? Or thank you.
شكرا.
Actually, okay then.
Ahmed Hussein, researcher at the Arab Center. Thank you very much for the three presentations. Regarding the EU, Amal, I think you didn't really go deep into identity because there is really no European identity. We cannot talk about European identity. What we had is actually an integration, economic integration, and there is also an aspiration to reach political integration for the time being. The circumstances of the formation of the EU are also to be taken into consideration, and that came as a response of totalitarian systems and regimes, and therefore USA also was pushing this process ahead, and this came after Maastricht, and one of the instruments and tools used by the EU and GCC area of GCC Council was established under different circumstances. Of course, we have the Iranian revolution. So my question, where is democracy, and how did you conduct this study? So unfortunately, we have only 1 minute, and we ask also the speakers to answer very briefly. So we start with you, the comparison between the EU and the GCC area.
أتفق مع الأستاذة فعلا تختلف في الهجرة، لكن ما يختلف أشكالها القانونية. وهناك كذلك هجرة عمالة في الاتحاد الأوروبي.
In the EU, of course, we have labor migration, migration of refugees, but the most important, everyone wants to improve his own economic situation, or people want to flee from the country, from atrocities and from any wars, for example. But for me, any migrant migrant means someone who is leaving his country and going to another country, whether it's in the GCC area or in the EU. Maybe you saw that I didn't deep dive into the topic, and I didn't talk a lot about the nature of these immigration waves and so on. There is no legal boundary with that area, for example. So people are moving from one place to another place to improve their economic situation, and the way we are dealing with the immigration here is different from the way they are dealing with it in Europe. You mentioned democracy. Well, I don't agree with you when you say that there is no European identity. Actually, identity is a political structure. I'll give you an example from Tunisia. And sometime Bourguiba, the previous president of the Tunisian Republic, he said at that time, because he had a problem with GCC countries, he said France is closer to us than the GCC area, and everything people studied in Tunisia in schools was in French. After we had problems with Europe, Bourguiba, the same president, started saying, no, we are Tunisians. And then they introduced even the Tunisian dialect into schools. And after that, there was a reconciliation between Tunisia and its identity. And after that, there was a constitutionalization of the Tunisian identity, and it's written in our constitution that we have an Arab Muslim identity. So I disagree with you in this regard. When you talk about the European identity, Europeans said our identity is 1, 2, 3, 4. So they have, for example, democracy, equality, and freedom. And even also they wanted to have a similar common language, the Esperanto language, but of course they failed in this attempt. But they have a concept of a joint, a common identity. Of course, culturally we are different. For example, in Ukraine, you have people who write in a completely different way, but they were convinced due to the tension with Russia. They want to join the Euro. In Azerbaijan, they don't say that they are Europeans. So I think that's a political situation. We want to talk about language and religion. It's something different. Question related introducing military service recently. Well, this is a result of the ongoing crisis in the region, and also the appearance of some extremist organizations in Iraq and Syria. So therefore, military service is one of the tools, one of the instruments to safeguard, to protect the structure of GCC countries. There was another question. Yes, the economic crisis. Of course, any future economic crisis will bring about different challenges, and this will question also the identity of GCC countries in the recent time, which are relying very much on oil. They are trying to redirect their focus and to adopt knowledge-based economies.
Yeah, for the cases of Kuwait and Oman, I said there isn't any case actually, and there should be further studies on Kuwait and Oman as the two other non-blockading countries within the GCC. And I would like to hear what has changed in Kuwait regarding the national identity debate after this intra-GCC crisis. Thank you.
التي لم نستطع أن نأخذها. شكرا لكم على حضوركم.
Thank you very much for coming. We'd like to thank all the participants. We'd like to thank all the speakers and panelists in this session. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank all those who asked questions. I want to say, maybe because of the recent crises, maybe in the future we need to rethink our structure. Thank you.